Join in. Welcome everybody. We are so excited to have you here today. We're going to keep letting people in, but we figured we would get started a couple minutes early. So thank you all for joining us today. Welcome to More Talks. This is More Talks from Thomas More University, where we present short, powerful talks devoted to spreading ideas, thoughts, and information to our community. I am your host, Michael Orr, and I am very excited to introduce our first panel discussion for More Talks. Today, we are talking about post-secondary education and what we see as the future there. I have with me here Mark Messingschlager, who is the Director of Financial Aid at Thomas More University. I have Kelsi Goins, Access and Diversity Admissions Counselor at the University of Cincinnati Blue Ash, and I have Kayla Ritter Rickels, who is the College Manager for the Office of Secondary Education for Cincinnati Public Schools. Guys, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. Happy to be here.
Yeah. I wanted to give you guys a few minutes to introduce yourselves and just to say a bit about yourselves and what you do. So if Kayla, if you don't mind starting off.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. Again, my name is Kayla Ritter Rickels, and I serve as the College Manager for Cincinnati Public Schools. What that means is for the entire district, I oversee three key pillars of work. So one is all of our college campus partners, or college partners in general, so college campus and college access partners. The second is I oversee all dual enrollment coursework for the district, and so our high school students that are taking college courses in their high school setting, that is a part that I manage. And then I also oversee all school counselors for the district, of which this fall we will welcome 54 across our high schools. In previous roles, I've worked in nonprofit and college access, and have previously worked in admission and enrollment offices at Thomas More and the University of Cincinnati. So I've been around this body of work in different roles and spaces across K-12 and in higher ed. So thanks for having us, and looking forward to the discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kayla. And Kelsi, do you mind going next?
Yeah, of course. So once again, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Kelsi. I am the Access and Diversity Admissions Counselor at UC Blue Ash College. So kind of what I do is I work closely with CPS in recruitment efforts. I also lead the recruitment efforts for diversity for Blue Ash College. And I also am the student staff supervisor. So if you ever send an email to the students, more than likely you'll be hearing from me. I have also been in secondary work as well before I came to UC. So I've kind of been around the block with education. So looking forward to our conversation.
Me too. And you actually are going to be moving into a new sort of position, not for work, but later today, you're going to be joining a new board. Is that correct?
Yes, I will be on the Thomas More Alumni Board, and I'm so excited.
We're very excited to have you. So Mark, are you want to go?
Absolutely. And congratulations, Kelsi.
Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Mark Messingschlager, Director of Financial Aid here at Thomas More University. So I oversee all of the eligibility, awarding, and disbursement of all of our student financial aid programs. So that includes all of our traditional daytime undergraduate students, as well as our adult undergraduate and graduate programs as well. I always say that I have basically three bosses. I have my normal reporting structure up through Thomas More, but then I also report to the U.S. Department of Education at the federal side, and as well as the state government. We get almost half of our funding through federal and state sources. So I answer to them almost as much as I answer to some folks here at Thomas More, because without that funding, we certainly wouldn't survive. So all of the money that comes through goes through us. Unfortunately, that also means that we have a lot of compliance and auditing that we have to do as well. And that's currently going on right now. That doesn't take a break with COVID or anything. So all of that auditing and things takes place through this office. So any federal dollars end up coming through my office. So that's what in my role here. Previously, I did a short stint in the financial investment world. So I was there long enough to get a sense of what that's like, and then brought that knowledge and transferred it over to the nonprofit education world.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today as well. And thank you both to Kayla and Kelsi. We're super excited to have you here. This is a topic that I think all of us are very passionate about. And so I'd like to go ahead and get started on the discussion. We have so much that we could talk about today. So this is built around post-secondary education, what we see as the future of post-secondary education, and some of the issues that we are observing now and possible solutions in the future for those issues. Let's just start out. We are in the middle of a pandemic with COVID-19 that has changed the landscape of education for everyone in the United States. I was wondering if you guys could talk about whether you see any permanent changes coming out of this for the education system, or whether you think that most of the changes are short-term, and if you could speak a bit to that.
Yeah, so I'm happy to start, and then I don't know, Kelsi and Mark, I'm sure you have other views as well. I think that one of the biggest pieces we're having to reckon with right now due to COVID-19 is access to traditional admission testing, in particular ACT and SAT, and how our potential applicants and potential students being judged or viewed through the admission process. And so as it relates to the access points, both the access to the test and access to the institutions, I think that those means are going to be different. You're seeing over and over again from small and possibly not well-known institutions all the way up through the Harvards of the world looking to go test optional. And I think that we will start to see a change in the evaluation and assessment process of what it means to be, quote, ready for college ready. What does that mean, and how will we change our the metrics? And we're being forced to do that in a time where how we have traditionally measured students, whether that's right or wrong, that we have to change that because people don't have access to those measures.
I agree with Kayla too, and I think we will start to see a lot more colleges going test optional and more of a holistic approach when we're doing the review of applicants. Also, I think we're going to see a lot more courses and colleges also open up to being more online to kind of meet the students anywhere. So I think those are going to be two of the big changes that we see this year. So of course, being more online, and then test optional going further than these just next 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in the short term, of course, no one really knows. There's going to be a lot more online than not, right? But I think in long term, I think this almost gives colleges like Thomas More a sigh of relief. The nonprofit, where we've really set our roots and anchored down into a value proposition of on-campus, face-to-face interaction. I think what we've seen in the last 4 or 5 months is that while there's plenty of need for online colleges and universities, and there's plenty of the population that wants to be online, there's a lot of students that don't want that either. And I think there's been a lot of colleges, especially the Thomas Mores of the world, the small nonprofit and even religious-based institutions, who were really afraid to dip their toe in the water of the online world, because they said, if we start to move too much toward online, what are we? What do we offer at that point? How does our mission change? And so I think a lot of schools like Thomas More were afraid to move to online. And now that everyone was forced to take that step together, now we're almost validated to say, okay, now that we know there's a giant population out there, and even a younger generation. I mean, sometimes that's the stereotype, is that younger generations favor technology and are more tech savvy. But we're seeing that even with our first-year students right out of high school. Did not like the experience at all of being online. And I think that emboldens us, and that really ties back to our mission to really offer that value of in-person, real-world experience at colleges, and not just for us at a 4-year nonprofit. I think the 4-year publics and community colleges in 2 years, and even the for-profits would be able to tap into that as well.
I think it's hard to undersell the value of the relationships that you build between either cohorts or with professors. But as you all said, technology is playing an increasing role in what those relationships look like. One of the issues that I know a lot of school systems have faced that we've seen is that access to technology, access to resources is changing radically, and those needs are changing radically. how do you see those changes occurring in your roles, and how do you see those changes affecting the landscape of education right now in terms of access to technology and the needs that our students are having?
Yeah, I mean, in the K-12 system, we have been one-to-one for the district I work for, one-to-one within our school buildings, and we've been really required to pivot and work as a team and as a large urban district to get our students the technology they need, but to also recognize that a computer is only useful, or an iPad is only useful if you have Wi-Fi for that. And so I think it also reframes for all of us that Wi-Fi is no longer this additional commodity that's great if you can have it, but really a foundational need to function in the world anymore, because it's how you receive your K-12 public education, or will be in some form. And so then, you know, how do you reframe that and think about that as a community problem, not just an education problem, because there are lots of other people that also need access, and Wi-Fi access is directly correlated to your socioeconomic status. So how do we think of it as a utility, just like water and heat? Not that everyone has access to those either, but really thinking about it in terms of a community service mindset as it relates to technology.
And I'll add to that, I agree completely. And there's always a funding gap there as well. And one of the challenges, and that's one of the things that I think we'll get into here in a little bit, talking about funding, but specifically for this question, yeah, it's a problem of access. And why is it a problem of access? Is because a lot of times the funding is not there. I've seen throughout the pandemic, I've seen a great number of applications come in for our emergency fund grant of technology, of lack of technology, not having Wi-Fi, not having laptop, or an old, hand-me-down laptop that siblings had for years and years and years, and is just not going to work for the stresses of an entire semester online. So how do we try to bridge that gap with financial aid that's was already being used for tuition, and now we need to try to stretch that even further to try to cover those pieces of a student's cost to attend the university as well. So that's just from the higher education piece. But as Kayla said, you got all of those same challenges, even more so on the K through 12 side as well.
I agree with Kayla and Mark as well. And I know at my university, I just did an event recently with the school district that Kayla works with the students. And the biggest debate was, it was virtual. It was, we just don't have access to Wi-Fi. And so how does a university at the size that I work at, how are we going to meet our students? Is it that we're providing Wi-Fi for our students? Is it that we are, or the hot spots for our students, are we expecting them to come onto campus during the middle of a pandemic just so that they can have access? So it's just questions that the university has to think about too, as like, how do we build that community and how do we support that community?
Very much so. And community is kind of at the core of a lot of these relationships, a lot of the learning experience. The other core that Mark brought up just a minute ago that I'd kind of like to dip our toes into is scholarship, and in terms of the needs that our students are facing with a lot of the economic upheaval that has happened in the wake of the pandemic. There's an increasing number of job loss for both parents and availability of work for students that they often rely on for funding for an education. I was wondering what you guys see as the ramifications of these unexpected economic difficulties on our student population. What can families in colleges do to continue pursuing post-secondary education? I guess it's kind of a big question, but let's start off with what do you guys see as the challenges that people are facing, and then do you see possible solutions to those challenges?
Sure, I'll kick that one off. So we're obviously seeing a lot of financial strain and stress through this time, and unfortunately a lot of unemployment. And typically what comes with periods of unemployment and or economic recession is that a lot of students, and particularly adult students, come back to either start a degree or finish a degree. And what you have within each workplace a lot of times is that if there's going to be a round of layoffs, a lot of times if everything else being equal, an employer will keep a person who has a higher degree. and either furlough or lay off a person without a degree. And so you have that at a micro level within all of these workplaces of people trying to scramble for position against their peers in terms of an education, of a degree. And so what you see is a lot of folks coming back to education in a time of recession that we're in right now. Of course, this one is different than one we've ever seen, but it's still an economic recession as well at the heart of it. And so what you end up with is a lot of times you have the same amount of resources, the same financial resources at the university level, but now also being stretched further to accommodate those students as well who are coming back, who have been impacted economically by the virus. So it's going to be tough. One of the things I will say is, Michael, your actual question is, what can students and families do? One, they can talk to us. So talk to the Office of Financial Aid, talk to an enrollment coach or an enrollment counselor at the school if they're coming into an institution of higher education. Talk to us and see what options we have. Sometimes we have these little rainy day things and some things that we can rattle the trees a little bit, see what comes out during these times. One of the best tools that we have in my office, and of course not just at Thomas More, any financial aid administrator across the country can do is what's called a professional judgment. And what that does is that takes a look at the FAFSA. So the free application for federal student aid, that's what all students apply for federal, and in many cases state and even institutional funding goes through the FAFSA as well. And so when students apply for that, it looks at what's called prior year data. So it looks at 2-year-old, the second prior year, 2-year-old data, tax data. So the FAFSA that we're looking at for the fall of 2020, this next month, the next fall semester, is actually looking at 2018 tax data. Well, that might as well be 50 years ago at this point, from what has happened in the last 6 months. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we in our financial aid offices can do is take a look at that and say, look, just throw that out the window. That doesn't matter anymore. You as a family, why don't you provide us with your actual financial situation as it stands now? You know, if you know, in some cases, and it's heartbreaking, a lot of times students are coming to me and saying both parents, if they do have a 2-parent household, both parents are unemployed at this point. Obviously much different than the situation was in 2018 many times. And so we can look at that and we can make adjustments on the FAFSA to account for that, and hopefully tap into some additional resources to try to grow the pie. You know, I mentioned sometimes the resources get stretched out among a greater amount of students. Let's try to increase that pie, increase the amount of resources. Now, at the end of the day, it's still taxpayer funded, so we still have to deal with that aspect of it. But you know, what can we do to get through the short term? So that's one thing, and I'll pause. I may have some more, but I'll pause and hear from the others.
I'll go next. So something that we've seen at Blue Ash is, well, with us being a regional college, a lot of students are moving from our Clifton campus to come to the Blue Ash campus, or they're going to Cincinnati State. So they're just trying to get in the pathway of UC, but not pay that amount because it will be cheaper by going to the regionals or the community college. So we're seeing that, but also making sure that these students are having conversations with enrollment counselors, and then we can send them into the direction of financial aid. So similar to what Mark stated, that's the biggest thing. Have those conversations with your enrollment counselors, so then you know, okay, so then they can push me into financial aid, or better yet, you know what, if I'm at Clifton's campus, I want to go to UC Blue Ash, I'm still going to have that same conversation with the enrollment counselor. So that's one thing that we're doing.
Yeah, and I would say linked to all of those is the barrier of students knowing how to navigate the system, right? So I, in my work and with our partners, will often say, like, you expect students to come to you college ready, but how are you thinking about being student ready as a college? And I think that in systems, all complex systems, but especially in higher education, there are a lot of hidden rules of the game. Like, you have to know to ask for a professional judgment or have somebody tell you you can do that. You have to know to ask for a transition between programs or something. And so, like, how do we, I mean, in the body of work that I lead is like, how do we make the invisible visible? But I think that's heightened right now because sometimes it's a whole lot easier just to shut down and say, never mind, I'm not going to college. and it doesn't seem feasible because of both my parents were laid off, and I don't have a car, and I don't have a laptop, and like it all feels overwhelming. And so I am really curious to think about how are colleges thinking through this. I think the other piece in this like links to this broadly is I don't know that colleges are in the same competition with other colleges, with peer colleges and institutions as they once were. So instead of a student thinking between two flagship institutions right now, they might be thinking, instead of going to the state flagship, I'm going to go to the local community college because I'm going to get the same classes for a quarter of the cost. And so really, like, I think this has flipped education and lots of other industries, but education on its head to really think about like the structures we have in place and how have we created barriers for students, and then how can we reduce those barriers by taking away some of that administrative or like just systems overhead.
I'll comment quickly on that. What Kayla just said. It's what we found was really there was an irony here with this pandemic in terms of online education, is that a lot of schools thought that they could broaden their application pool by offering classes online. Right? You can accept anybody from anywhere in the world, or at least in the U.S., and they can take your classes online. But what the pandemic has proved is what Kayla just said, is these students are realizing, well, if I'm going to end up online anyway, I might as well just go close to home, and I don't have to live on campus. I don't have to do X, Y, Z, so I might as well just stay close to home. And it's almost been a complete 180 from what the result, that we expected. So one of the things that I'll kind of wrap up real quick with this conversation is, as I mentioned, the recession really kind of changes the model of financial aid and the access there, and what the end result is usually turns out to be is a higher level of borrowing, student borrowing. So that can be a detriment. Within reason, it can be it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? So we always talk about higher education as being an investment in yourself. And if you're a good investor, if you're making a smart investment, then it's not necessarily a bad thing to borrow student loans, again, within reason. But of course, what we'll see, and we see it all the time, is that some students just, unfortunately treat it as a blank check sometimes. And there's loans that are out there, and so they'll take them. So what we will see, I know what we will see, what I can predict out of this, is we will see a higher level of borrowing, because students who may not have borrowed before and gotten by will probably have to borrow now to continue that education. And so one of the things that I would, as Kayla mentioned, how can schools be student ready, is, I would challenge schools, and I think we do a pretty good job here at Thomas More, but I would challenge all schools to look at, students are making a pretty large investment in your school. What kind of investment are you making into your students? And that kind of encapsulates this whole conversation in terms of technology, access, and financial resources, and those types of things. So I think we spent a long time on that conversation. So if we're ready to move, we'll move, but I can talk on that one obviously for a long time.
I think that is an incredibly important conversation. And I want to come back, actually, now that you've touched on loans, I do have a question that I want to touch on about loans, but we do have a question from our chat. I want to encourage anyone that's listening, if you have questions that you want addressed, please feel free to leave them in the chat. I'm more than happy to moderate your questions as well. This conversation should be valuable to everybody. So a lot of the conversation we just had around scholarship and student readiness was about communication. And how are we being intentional about communicating? I think that's going to be even more important than ever. So how are you seeing your offices and departments in your institution sharing this information? How are they being changed as conduits of information? What kind of changes do you see needed in terms of how communication is conducted internally and externally to students?
So I don't work for a college, but we work a lot with colleges. And I would say one of the best examples of a body of work that actually Kelsi and I do together is we have really tried to rally around the transition of students and matriculation of students broadly as systems partners. So what information or data do we hold uniquely about the students? in a K-12 system. For instance, we know who has an IEP or a 504. We can't give that to our college partners, but if we have really strong systems relationships, we can say, you need to talk to this person in accessibility services and create better and warmer handoffs. And in doing that, I hope, and last summer we saw some really good data returns on this too, but for more successful matriculation and better sense of belonging in institutions. Now that's like K-12 to college, and how do you work in that divide? And I have a lot of passion for that divide and how you navigate and bridge that. But I do think that it's really important for institutions to then be making purposeful linkages between their institutional offices, which so often at small and large institutions can be a real barrier because of silos and politics and unions and all kinds of things. But that would be a real example of like how we are working across the system to support students and then provide direct communication as well.
And I'll go next. So I lead the charge for our CPS Summer Melt, and I work with Kayla's team on this charge, but I am the person that the students communicate with on a weekly basis. I send out weekly emails, and I've also gathered a team. So when these students do come to us and I hand them off to, for example, there's someone from financial aid that they work with directly. There's someone from our student life office that they work with directly. And of course, me being directly from the admissions team. So just making sure that they are meeting with people that I've directly put them in contact with. And I also, when I'm in the schools doing recruitment efforts, I also bring financial aid with me so that the students know, okay, so when you come to UC Blue Ash, this is your contact. So we have definitely been making sure that we are more strategic in making sure that departments work better together.
So what I'll add to that is we tend to be the receiving end of that. So typically folks are sending students and families our way. So we try to get out ahead of that, and we work with other offices on campus. But what we try to preempt that with is direct communication to students and parents. And we feel that's a better and more direct way, and especially with the pandemic. So one of the things internally, sometimes it's even harder to have meetings internally because, you know, half your folks are remote, half of them are in the office, you know, what have you. So what we're doing is trying to develop ways to communicate directly with students. Some kind of an email campaign. A Financial Aid Friday is always a good one within the financial aid realms, and sending out basically mass communications to students, but as well as parents. You know, parents are a lot of times the ones that are getting that information. You know, sometimes the students, especially right now, as a first-year student, I can't imagine, they have to be overwhelmed with a lot of things. And so we try to involve parents as much as we can. You know, some parents, you know, want to be involved. Other parents are trying to purposely take a step back and let that student develop and evolve into their own adult. But in this time, I mean, it just takes hand-holding from everyone. So the communication piece is absolutely key. And obviously it's electronic communication right now. I mean, we have very limited access to our physical office, you know, with the masks and everything. So there's barriers right there. So everything electronic that we can do, and even something as simple but as large of an impact as orientations. So the first-year students are not going to be able to do face-to-face orientations in many cases this year, and that's what we've seen here at Thomas More. We would have had orientations as early as mid-April. Obviously, it didn't happen. So we've gotten that online, of course, but still, you know, questions. Some questions probably did not come through that may have been asked during that day of orientation. So trying to preempt that, trying to break those orientations out and send them out in bite-sized pieces through mass communication to get students to try to be ready as best we can. And of course, you know, just our own reports, trying to compare as best we can, any way we can, to last year. How are we doing? Our students, at least in terms of the numbers, the raw numbers from our reports. I'm the numbers guy, right? The financial aid. How do they compare to last year? Can we at least rest a little bit easier that we're somewhat on track with last year's class in terms of, you know, loan application completion or FAFSA completion or what have you, to try to draw some kind of comparison to how we are doing in terms of effectiveness of getting our message out. but also students receiving that message and doing what they need to do to be ready.
Yeah, and I think that those are really great points, and would say that cautiously say that this is a space where for-profit college post-secondary institutions often excel. And so although they might have predatory practices and predatory charges, their customer service is bar none, and students do not get lost in that funnel. And so how do you create systems where the user experiences it as one system rather than this fragmented, like, well, you have to go to Kelsi for this, but then you have to see Mark for this, and then where we're passing someone around, it's too easy for them to give up. And so I like, you know, we all have to think about what we can learn from spaces, even if we don't love the practices broadly. And I think that's a really good example of one.
That is an excellent point, and it speaks to a lot of the changes in the development of how colleges and universities can learn from other spaces. In terms of how we can learn from other spaces, especially from like the point of view of a four-year traditional school, we have a question from our audience about how do you see the role of community colleges as an in-between option in terms of, you know, maybe a first and second year higher ed student that then can look to invest further in a four-year school. Do you see this as something growing? Do you see more people taking that option? And then how do you and your roles address that?
I don't know that option has changed, but I certainly think it's going to be magnified, right? So I think a lot of students are going to take a look at a four-year degree and say, okay, well, I can't make that big of an investment right now, but I will do the two-year community college and get some of my general education courses, my University 101 type of classes out of the way. Of course, the problem that we run into a lot of times is transferability. So how do those classes translate into a full degree? Is it going to add on a fifth year, and are you going to end up paying more in the long run? So it certainly can be done, and that certainly is a viable option, but you need to have a four-year mindset if you're going to go the two-year option to bridge that gap.
I would say this is really where the regional colleges are in the forefront of things. So like, of course, with UC and Ohio State and even Miami, having our students start at Blue Ash for your first 2 years, you're saving $10,000, but also getting that there's not an issue when you transition to the Clifton College. Your credits are already in our system, super smooth transition. You literally fill out a change of college form and you are on your way. So I think that's where we're going to kind of win in the world of regional colleges and community colleges. Community colleges, like Mark said, it just might be a little bit harder for students to transfer over. Are their courses going to be the same as they would on a four-year institution? So you definitely run into those issues. So that's where we win.
Yeah, and I think all of that requires the students to know their goals and themselves pretty deeply, because to be able to transition institutions, you do have to be able to continue to navigate different systems, and you have to put a lot of forethought into how do you plan for the coursework and financially. But I do think that community colleges and technical colleges play a critical role. And as we look at access, I mean, being open access institutions, of which regional campuses can also be open access, play a critical role in making sure that we're serving all demographics, not just demographics that can meet the traditional markers of college admission.
All excellent points. And Kayla, to piggyback off of your final statement there on the access, I think that one of the big things that we've seen alongside of the pandemic, especially across the news, is a growing need to address access and, you know, diversity and justice as something that is critical to both the field of education and across our society at large. So I'd really like to ask you guys how you see colleges and universities, post-secondary education as a field, having opportunities to make changes in those fields to open up access, and what changes need to be made right now.
I would say that a system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. And if we're not happy with the system, we have to be willing to make some changes. But I think individual institutions have to really ask, like, what is our end goal? So diversity is the equivalent of counting, and is not a good thing if you're not ready to include them in your community and you're not going to take the steps you need to make sure that they have a sense of place and will be successful. That access is not necessarily the goal, it's the achievement that we're looking for, right? So people who enter college and then do not finish college are worse off than people that never entered college in the first place. Like, that's national data and will be shown time and time and time again. And so how do we, on the student side, whatever age the student is, really make sure that they have a sense of direction and an opportunity to know what they're hoping for and what they're looking for, and then how do we press upon accountability to make sure students are successful. And I think in a heightened age of Black Lives Matter, that colleges are really having to reckon with their anti-racism practices. So what happens when a faculty member or a staff member says something that is racist, and how do we deal with that? And how does that implicate the community overall? And I will never say it's going to be easy work, because it's going to be hard and it's going to hurt the bottom line sometimes. But if we're going to do right by students, and if individual institutions are going to say that they're about inclusion or diversity or whatever word that institution wants to use, then you have to see that in your practices, and you have to give up some of that power to the folks that are impacted so that they can tell you what it needs to be, rather than all of us sitting in our seats of power saying, like, we think it would be best if we did this. And I think it's going to take a lot of fortitude for institutions to move through that.
And what I'll add to that is, I agree completely that actions speak louder than words on that. And I think that gets to Kayla's point of, you can say you're about inclusion and diversity, and you can start to recruit and target those students. But at that point, you're really just going after students, right? You're really just trying to increase your student population. And so if you don't have the staff and the faculty that reflect that diversity and inclusion, then that will, that just kind of soils the argument for everybody involved. And so the actions need to be there, as well as the intentions. And I think we can all, social media is not bad, but there are a lot of bad players on social media too, and that can lead into things, and it's easy for us to get tunnel vision sometimes, right? And that's the idea that if we like what we hear, or if we hear someone say something close to our own opinion, then we follow that, and we follow it down a rabbit hole to where we only hear things that we would ourselves say. And so I think I think we in this nation are struggling with that right now, is some tunnel vision. And while I think social media is a good thing, I think social media definitely feeds to that. And I think we need to talk about things like bias. How does bias get formed, and what does implicit bias look like? I hear plenty of people say, well, I'm not racist, but, and then they immediately say something or do something that would contradict that. And they truly, they don't think they're being racist at all. And that's part of that conversation of bias. And I think if we can have that, and I think institutions of higher education are the place where that should start, or where that should be cradled, and have those conversations of, okay, well, you don't think that you're racist, but let's talk about bias and where bias comes from, and let's look at your background and your culture and what you've been, what you've been brought up through, and maybe you weren't necessarily brought up to be racist, and that's how a lot of this happens. You weren't necessarily brought up to be racist, but things are there that you're not recognizing. So I think that's something that institutions, I think, can very much take charge of.
Mm-hmm. I agree with Kayla and Mark, and also the biggest thing is action. So what is the university or the higher ed institution doing to ensure that we're bringing in diversity and inclusion in all aspects? Having webinars is great, but we need a little bit more. Having, protests are absolutely amazing, and sending our thoughts to our president of the university, but what is the Board of Trustees doing to implement these changes at the university, and making sure that the university also is a little bit more inclusive. So those are just some of the things that we have to do, just moving forward. So hoping for change.
I couldn't agree more. It really is, like you said, about action, and it's about intentionality and showing that change is something that's both necessary and a priority, from both the lowest to the highest levels of any institution. In terms of access to education, one of the things that is the biggest barriers to access is access to financial aid. And a lot of that does come from loans. I did say that I wanted to return back to this question. How do we look at access to financial aid and loans in terms of their place in the institutional aid? Student loans are one of the largest expenses that people have early on in life. They can be defining for a lot of students in terms of where they can go, what opportunities they have. Do we see alternatives popping up for access to education financially apart from student loans? Do we see student loans increasing over time? What do you guys think that will look like for the future in terms of access to education?
I've got a few thoughts. So in terms of student loans, so student loans can a lot of times get a bad rap in terms of what fits the narrative sometimes. So student loans at their core are a piece of financial aid. They are assistance to help students, again, in that investment. Now, what is the appropriate amount of student loans that a student should take to achieve that investment? At what point does it become a bad investment, right? So those are the questions that need to be asked. So the federal government actually puts that answer in place. So they answer that for all colleges across the country. The maximum that a dependent, a traditional age student right out of high school, the maximum amount of loans that they can borrow from the federal government is $5,500 for 1 year. And that doesn't matter whether you're going to the two-year community college in your local neighborhood or whether you're going to Harvard. It's $5,500 across the board. And so the federal government has tried to answer that question. Now, of course, they're painting with a broad brush, as they tend to do, but they've answered that question definitively already. What tends to get folks in trouble is when they borrow beyond that. And that's what can lead to poor decision making. Again, sometimes it's still a good investment to go over that $5,500. Depends what your situation is, depends what your goal is, depends what your trajectory is. But sometimes we see folks borrowing 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 times the amount of their federal loan eligibility in private student loans that have a much higher interest rate, that don't have a lot of the same protections or safety nets as the federal government loans. And those are really the ones that get a bad rap. So when you hear the news stories about how student loans in this country have cumulatively, they are now more than credit card debt. There's more student debt in this country than credit card debt, and it's surpassed $1.5 trillion now, and that's going to be the next bubble, the economic bubble, although I think COVID-19 beat it to the chase. It's really the over borrowing that we're talking about. Borrowing is an essential tool for any investment, right? We all borrow to buy a new car. We all borrow to buy a house. We all borrow for these things, these milestones in life. So education is no different. So many students, many of us, right here in this conversation, borrowed to put ourselves through college, and it worked out just fine. But it's the over borrowing that's the issue. Now, what I'll kind of frame all of that conversation to answer your question, Michael, in terms of overall financial aid, we're still waiting on a reauthorization of the Higher Education Act in this country. So to turn to a policy slant, a federal policy, not political, I promise I won't get political, but from a policy standpoint, the Higher Education Act goes back to 1965, and it's designed to be rewritten and redone and reevaluated every 4 to 5 years. The last reauthorization of Higher Education Act was in 2008 during the last recession. So we've gone 12 years, which is, by the way, the longest that it's ever been since reauthorization. So, there's been some things that have been tried and failed over the last several years in terms of reauthorization. What happens, and unfortunately, this is sometimes a side effect of Congress, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be a split Congress as we are right now. Of course, you'd rather have a split Congress to get, a more unbiased approach for some of these issues. 90% of both sides of the aisle agree on certain things and what they want in the next reauthorization. It's the 10% that gets everybody riled up and makes the headlines. So what I would love to see in a perfect world is let's move forward with the 90% and deal with the 10% later on. So having said all of that, what is in the 90%? So what is probably going to come down the line is one grant option. So right now there's the major grant, the federal Pell Grant, but there's also a few supplemental grants that are in there as well that the colleges have access to. I think what will happen is that'll get rolled up into either a more a sturdy or a beefed up Pell Grant that might have some institutional flexibility with that, so that we can have some say as institutions as to who gets more or less of that money based on their individual need. There'll also be one loan program, and more importantly to that, one repayment option. Right now, some of the issues with students on student loans is they don't know what their options are for repayment, and that's the piece of the puzzle where they feel like they've been dropped or fell through the loophole, is when it comes to repayment, then no one's there to help support them. They've already graduated from school, so sometimes the colleges and universities don't support them anymore, and they're left on their own to deal with repayment. So one repayment, I think, is what will come out of that. So those are some of the things that will come down the line from a policies perspective once we finally get a new authorization of the Higher Education Act, which deals with the Title IV, the funding, the actual financial aid piece. But that's my comment for now. And I'll let Kelsi and Kayla join in.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge push in the access space for doubling Pell or increasing Pell, and really thinking about that. I think we also, as we think about like funding higher education and we think about access, we also have to acknowledge and recognize that not everyone, one, has the same financial literacy taught to them throughout their life, and two, doesn't always have the same relationship with money. And I mean that in like, there are people in our systems, across all kinds of systems and all kinds of communities, that have already racked up debt prior to high school graduation, or have family histories of trauma, of experience in working with money. And so how do we provide that support, and how do we say, to Mark's point earlier, like, this is an investment in yourself and you are worth investing in, but getting to the point of being able to pull the trigger on investing in yourself can be really hard for someone that has not had that relationship with money. And their family history has also not had that relationship with money or access to money, or even financial institutions. So I think there's a lot of like, all of this is a layered system, right? So we like have to talk about that, and we have to think about that. I think there's an interesting kind of spin-off of college funding as it relates to doing income sharing rather than loans too. And I will tell you personally, I'm not quite sure how to feel about income share plans, so I'm not going to tell you that they're good or bad, just that that's another method and far lesser utilized of essentially making a bet on a student and saying, with a degree program in this field, you're likely to make X amount of money, and so you'll pay X percentage of your income every single year. And so if I go into the medical field, my income, I'm going to pay a smaller percentage, but it might be more money than if I go into a field that might not typically have a high starting income. And so I think that's interesting. And again, like I said, I don't have an informed opinion about whether those are good or bad things, just a different funding structure overall. And definitely one that in some ways is trying to kick the loan piece, but all of this, right, you are worth investing in yourself, and figuring out how to invest in yourself is really important.
I agree with Kayla and Mark. I also agree with access and the financial literacy point, that each student's coming from a different system. And making sure, even as an admissions counselor, like we're aware of that when we go into different schools, because each student is going to be different on what they know about loans and whatnot, and if they have been affected by through debt. So just making sure that we're aware of those things as well when we go and recruit these students and start talking and having these conversations on how to finance college.
I couldn't agree more. And I think a core message that has come out of most of these questions is just more intentional communication, changes in how we communicate. And, these relationships are all going to be built on how well institutions of higher education can continue to communicate or learn to communicate differently with both their student audience and their internal audience as well, to set goals and to be better at making those things available. So I want to thank you all for coming today. Thank you to our audience for joining us, and thank you so much to our panelists for taking the time. It's been wonderful speaking with you, so much great insight. I want to give you all a final opportunity to say some final words. If you have any final advice, especially for high school seniors or college freshmen, I would love to hear that really quickly. Kelsi, if we could start with you and then move on to Kayla and then Mark.
Definitely. So for high school seniors, get those virtual visits in early. The earlier the better, the less stress. Mark, I am going to give a plug to financial aid. October 1st is usually when FAFSA opens. I recommend getting that done as soon as possible. I tell my students this all the time. And for college freshmen, staying organized is key, and networking for different opportunities during that year. And during your time in college. So good luck.
Yeah. I would target my advice specifically to college freshmen and say that it's really important for you to know that if you got into college, you belong in college. And so you can be there and you can be successful, and it will be hard. But if you were able to get through the system to be accepted, wherever you are accepted, you are also, you belong there, and you can be successful there.
Great points. And what I would add is I'll send a broad message to both incoming seniors in high school as well as incoming first-year students in high school, or to higher education, excuse me. This has been a very trying time for everyone. Mm-hmm. Own it. There's nothing you can do about it. This is your situation. These are to use one of my favorite expressions, this is the hand you've been dealt, right? Own it. You can certainly commiserate with all of your other folks that are in the same situation as you, but lean on them as well. They're in that same situation with you. Use them as resources. Make friends out of this. This is probably going to be this generation's 9/11 or Pearl Harbor or what have you. So there's nothing you can do to reverse that. So you might as well own it and make the best of it. And how can you come out of that in a positive light? But use the resources around you. We are all of us living are going through it together, so we can help. And one thing that I'll close out on, I'll close on a high note, is throughout all of this, through the pandemic and everything, I've been really encouraged by how understanding people in general have been through the process, through higher education. How people are willing to really work with each other, and they've been more patient because of the situations. A lot of people are working from home with kids screaming in the background or dogs barking or whatever. People are understanding that. It's good to take a minute to laugh about that, to really just maybe not appreciate the situation, but appreciate the what's going on around you, that this is so unique, and own it, and that's what makes us survivors. That's what makes us prosper in the end, is because we can own that situation and learn from it and do good out of it.
Fantastic advice from all three of you. Once again, thank you so much for joining us, Kelsi, Kayla, and Mark. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you for our audience for joining us for MORETalks. Just as a final note, this has been recorded, so we are going to be posting it once it's been finalized out to our Thomas More Moreover website. You will be receiving a link to that in the follow-up email to this. Thank you so much for joining us. If you enjoyed this conversation, if you think that there's value here, please feel free to share this with your communities. I think there's a lot of great points that were made here, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much.